So we're in a day and age now where people are have so much access to information, but they think that it's knowledge and they try to apply it, and then there's the disconnect, right? Strength, a lot of times we're thinking of just the physical component. Is a tissue strong? Well, the tissue could be strong, but maybe it's in a bad position, which makes that component part weak.
Chris, thanks for coming on again.
Hey man, we made it happen finally.
I know
A
for
lot of
the
technical
listeners
stuff,
won't
but we made
know.
it happen.
They won't know, but this is the second time we've had to record this. Few technical difficulties the first time, but we're back. I'm very grateful to Chris for giving up some more of his time to come chat.
Oh, definitely not giving up, man. I'm excited to have another conversation, chat about it. So I'm ready to rock and
Yeah,
roll.
man. All right. So I think it'd be interesting for you to tell listeners a little bit of how what your story is and kind of how you did get to where you are now.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, it's being as of right now, title would be performance therapist, and getting to this point now. Been in the industry for close to about 14, I guess, close to 15 years now, and it's been quite a journey. I think to your point, a lot of what I hold, and that's very similar to a lot of stories, is the same thing as a love and passion for sports. A lot of times, either going in through injury or just having the performance, success kind of pulls people back into this field, whether it's in coaching in the sport or at least into some athletic capacity, being on the fitness and strength movement and preventative care side of things. So for me, it was no different in that sense. But I was really interested in training ever since I was young. So I guess it kind of gravitated and pulled me that direction, although it was never my goal to say. So when I got started, I was just kind of helping out. And
Yeah.
I didn't have any type of certifications. I wasn't, insured by any means. So I was just doing what I can, had an opportunity from someone to help out with some athletes inside of a studio kind of gym space. And that was the beginning. So went through there and actually took about maybe 7 to 8 months, and then ended up in a kind of a situation where I almost got sued just by being affiliated with, said company
Yep.
for some things that I actually didn't know were going on in the back end business wise. So that was, really fortunate for me to figure out and find out when I'm, 18, 19 years old. So from there, I actually just went to the fields and started bringing athletes there. And I did that for a couple years and was just doing that, trying to just, I guess, not even really make money. At that point, you're showing up, you're picking kids up if you can, right? If they can't
Yep.
get rides, you're training them for free. You're sometimes paying and buying them lunch afterwards and dropping them
Yep.
off. And you're not making a dime. So that was no different for me. Did that for years. And it took a while till I got almost like, I call it an opportunity. It was more circumstantial and just, happenstance, where a buddy of mine was like, hey, let's go check out this gym that my brother works at. And at the time, I'm like, I kind of have a space. I'm on the field. I'm all good. But when I walked into that facility, it was like nothing I had seen. It was a private corporate wellness facility, but it was multi-million-dollar, layout. Everything was as pristine. It was brand new. You had, Kaiser equipment, the platforms, turf. You had athletes coming in and out. They had chiropractic and physical therapy on site. I'm like, yo, I don't know what's going on here, but yeah, let me figure it out. Like, let me in the room. So that's kind of what I asked. I was like, is there a way that I could just either shadow or intern here just to learn what's going on? Because you guys are doing something on the high level, and I'm not. So that's really where everything really kickstarted. That was a big catalyst there. Big thanks to TJ Merritt, Tyler Bell. They were the ones that kind of first got me going in this industry, and directed me a lot of the way. And then that kind of exposed me into this other realm of just performance, but also we were in a corporate wellness setting. So I'm getting a lot of Gen Pop, and they had a lot of different issues, right? And those are a little bit more on the pain side or movement dysfunction side. Where on performance, we're constantly just moving numbers, trying to get them higher and whatnot, or for speed lower. So it kind of took me down that route, and it wasn't directly into performance anymore. It's almost like I had done performance, was now in this corporate setting where I was able to bring my own athletes. Always had a small but continuous flow of athletes that I was training throughout the years. But I was really kind of dedicated now to almost training the staff that we were going to start to bring in and build. So it kind of became director of education for many years as well, where, trying to, get kids who were just fresh out of college or just got their CSES, or a lot of them were going to PT school, right? This was kind of like that intermittent phase for them. So it was fun to kind of just build a training program, to, build training protocols and manuals and stuff. And that director of education role, I really tried to take on. So I really just went out there and started learning as much as I could. And luckily, that's just something that I wanted to do anyway. So it was
Yeah.
the best position I could have had, which was, hey, we're going to pay you just to go out there and learn as much as you can, and then come back and try to teach and help us all. And that was really happened for years, my man. So through all that kind of learning and just education and trial and error, and with a lot of reps, just slowly got not like better, but I guess more refined. You know what I mean? I guess better, but more refined
Yeah.
in skill, technique, and just what you're going to use, and not just knowledge, but the intelligence that comes with it. So
Hmm.
it's been quite a journey. And fast forward now, where I've kind of used almost to a clinical setting, and now back onto performance therapy, which is pretty much going from table to turf or table to track,
Yeah.
and now pretty fully back into performance, while also still being able to kind of help out on that other end with either it's Gen Pop or youth development, specifically either with pain or injury, but also just performance side as well.
Yeah. Well, did you have a degree in exercise science or biomechanics or anything like that, or what was your like formal education in?
Yeah, so I mean, I was finishing my kinesiology degree, right? Like a
Okay.
lot, I actually was in junior college first. Was
Yeah.
there longer than anyone should be, and took me a while to get out. Yeah, and by the time I was going to university, finishing this kinesiology degree was the same time that I was running this, kind of director of education role. So I had a lot of
Okay.
coaches that I was currently kind of training and kind of helping build up, and they all already had degrees, most in kinesiology or movement science of some sort. And some of them were going for their masters or had masters, and some were going to PT school. And technically, I was kind of educating them in a sense, for lack of a better term. So it kind of just created this quarrel. And I was actually supposed to finish, to be honest with you. And then I had some like they wanted me to go back. I had to like retake Spanish and math. Yeah, I was supposed to be on my last semester. I just finished all the other bullshit. Yeah, I think I had like 3 classes left, and then they're like, "Yeah, by the way, you got to retake Spanish and math." And I don't know what the fuck happened, but it kind of messed me up for a while, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Kind of back and forth for at least a year, of do I go try to finish this and redo all these credits for whatever reason. And I just had a lot of people in my ear and in my corner that were like, you might not need it for where you're
Hmm.
at, what you're doing, the experience. So it kind of made me double down on myself. So from there, kind of everything just pushed as, all right, who's at the top? What are they doing? Who's doing, cool things, new things, good things, weird things? Go out there, learn, and then just try to piece it all together, and just continue to try to do my best.
So, how did you get those first kind of clients when you say you're training kids in the park and doing things like that? What was the process of like how did you get to even that point? Because a lot of people I think don't even realize how they can get their first few clients in the door, and like you said, it's not about necessarily making money at that point or getting anything more from them than just experience for yourself and helping people as you do.
Yeah, I mean, so as I was saying, I kind of got this opportunity initially where the guy I was training with before was like, "Hey, like, I know you're not playing football anymore, but if you would want, like, I need some help kind of training on the back end here."
Hmm.
And I was like, I don't have anything, but I would love to, pick it up and get after it. So it was a lot of, kids from there. Once I left, there was a handful that kind of followed me, and, we went to the fields and just kind of utilized that. And then there was
Hmm.
also some kids I had met while I was playing football that were interested, and they had kind of reached out and got in touch. And luckily, it's kind of just been word of mouth. I'm a terrible salesman. I've never really sold anything. Ever since I've started, I've just been lucky in getting a lot of word of mouth, to be honest with you. So yeah, again, those first clients was kind of in that initial state, and then luckily since then, it's pretty much just been word of mouth. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what was your like obviously now you kind of have your hands in a few different plots and things going on, but what is your main kind of stream of business? Is it the NFL performance side of things? Is it your private stuff? Like how does that all work for you? Just for I think it's interesting talking to coaches that are in the private sector but not necessarily working for a gym that's already established. They're more working for themselves.
Yeah, it's all private practice for the most part. There's a large income. Sometimes you get some
Hmm.
contracting opportunities, whether it's um, specifically with like one-off athletes or something like that, speaking engagements, educational engagement, stuff like that. Um, but really, it's been the bulk of the income is still one-on-one, right?
Yeah.
I think that's something that I would like to change to get that closer to 50-50, right? A little bit more passive income by be creating, but more so in the sense of just creating more educational content for others, right? I've kind of been almost luckily and very fortunately kind of almost positioned where I'm getting a lot more people kind of interested and curious on how I'm able to, I guess, utilize a lot of tools. So I think providing those educational resources is honestly something that people have been reaching out for. So I'm looking, specifically in the next year or so to push that out, and hopefully help a few people out there as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because that was kind of what I wanted to touch on at some point in this podcast is like for someone in your position, what is, you know, what do you see as what's next on the horizon as far as obviously continuing to do what you do, but what do you want to kind of add to what you're doing? And it also goes with even with this podcast, it originally started for me, well, for a few different reasons, but one of the main reasons because I was heavily or still am heavily into youth, high school, and also collegiate athletics. But I just realized there's so much misinformation out there, and especially when it comes to parents understanding, what their kids should be doing, all that sort of stuff. So I just wanted there to be a home base for even just parents of kids I train to be able to listen and at least know that they're training with somebody who cares enough to talk to people like yourself or try to do whatever it may be to just be better as a coach and as a person. But what it's also transitioned into, and what even go into, go back to Cayman and things like that, just being around other like minded coaches was super inspiring. And it makes you want to, do things and challenge yourself and all these other things. And one of the reasons with this podcast that I want to do that is to put out information for coaches that I hope to go a little deeper into things that coaches need, whether that's the X's and O's side or even, I run a business myself. Obviously, a lot of coaches need help with business, all of that sort of thing. So it's like creating this place that coaches can have a little bit of everything in the new kind of, I don't know, not modern world, but you know what I mean, where strength and conditioning, everybody's trying to find a way to, make a full-time living from it.
It's difficult, man, and I think I forget often is how new of an industry this still is.
Yeah.
Um, and it's still one of those kind of rare and weird industries where people will see or meet with an expert and almost think that they can replicate that same skill work or knowledge either their own or somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it's you wouldn't do that with a dentist or a doctor or the guy working on your car, right? So similarly, in this industry we kind of get that. There's still so many ways that I think are coming about, right? There's still new jobs and new opportunities being created probably daily. um, so there's a lot of different avenues, right? I think for me, the one-on-one has always been the main driver, right? At least financially, and just something that it's always just kind of come because it's always just been another call or referral, luckily, right? But yeah, to your point, I think there's different avenues. There's some people who are just coaching online, who probably, and there, to be honest with you, there's coaches out there and people out there that ain't never worked with no one, right? And they're creating, throwing educational stuff up there, and they don't technically understand it. So we're in a day and age now where people have so much access to information, but they think that it's knowledge and they try to apply, and then there's the disconnect, right? And then it's easy to get swayed because then if everyone's an expert, then everyone has the answer. So if you listen to one person, that's the answer, but someone else, so it gets confusing. So to your point, there's so much misinformation out there, and it's difficult to navigate. So, and that's not just for the coaches, but it's also for the clientele. So now you have two different pools all coming together for the same reasons, but are having difficulty either communicating, understanding within their own circles and cycles. That when we come to meet face to face, sometimes there's more clashing than there needs to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like the more, I guess where a lot of the misunderstanding comes from as well is the for coaches that are, posting online and sharing information, which is awesome. It's great. But for people that maybe don't have a background in strength and conditioning and are just consumers and people interested in it, there comes that like to be successful almost it appears that you have to be polarizing. So you need to stand firm on this one idea that, this is the way to go, not the other things, or that's the way to go, not those things. And it creates, I don't know, this idea of like you almost don't know what to listen to anymore. And the more that I learn and the more that I get into the field of everything is like there's times and places for just about anything. So I don't know. What's your thoughts on everything that you see out there?
It's tough. And we're always going to be pulled towards what we think is interesting, what we kind of
Yeah.
believe in. And to your point, I don't think that's a bad thing. There's misinformation, there's good information, there's bad information. In the end, it's just information. There's things
Yeah.
that were true at one point or still are, but maybe used in a different context, different time or place. So there's just a lot that goes into it. So because there's just so much being put out there, it's probably hard. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing different institutions or different companies. A great example is Altus, right? You got really like-minded people with a really solid mission, and everyone's kind of gravitating and coming together for those reasons, right? So it's not only obviously elite education, high level of everything, right? But it kind of pulls that culture together. So it becomes a place that coaches and like-minded coaches want to go, and that's no different than anything. But I think we're going to see more of that happening because of this, right? I go back to like what happened before 2020 was there was a lot more, even just gyms with really good coaches. And then once COVID hit, everyone had to become their own company, become their own business. So we started to navigate that world because we couldn't go face to face anymore in person. We did it over screens. So now we had new people, new coaches with just information or, knowledge as well. And they're just trying to navigate how to do that. So now you separated everyone and now everyone's talking and doing their own thing, their own methods, their own languages. And there's no massive issue with that. But as an industry, it's pulled us further and further apart. So I think what we're seeing now with places like Altus and other places that are doing, really good things. I think Les Feldman, over here, we're doing some really cool stuff and getting people together to do some really good things as well. And it's finally kind of going back to where it was is, hey, these people are going to find each other. And we're just going to kind of help build these things for people to then come to and build upon as well. So I think it's going to be a little cyclical like that. And we've probably gotten close to that point where the pendulum needs to kind of sway the other way just a little bit. Because it's going to get a little chaotic and we're going to start to point fingers a little bit, which I don't think is necessary, because it's still just a lot of language barriers at one level. And there's just misguidance between what's trying to be communicated compared to just saying what's right, what's wrong, that's good, that's bad.
Yeah. And it builds on something that I remember you saying last time we spoke, where you're very principles based. And when you're principles based, you can kind of see where the black, white, and maybe gray areas are. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, and you don't have to go super into everything you believe in, but what are some of those principles that you like come top of mind to you when you are filtering through information as a coach?
There's a lot. And, I think I just the big ones, to be honest with you, the principles have kind of been proven pretty consistent. And that's just, you can go to like the basics of just anatomy and how that works and the biology and just how that works. And you kind of just live within those frames. So it's nothing, I guess, in particular. We don't need to go too nitty gritty, but right. Like if we're doing tissue work, right. The fact of like mechanotransduction, that's a principle. Like that's really important to know why that's working, and it gives guidance of when you can use it. Right. Obviously people use Davis law and then said principle, very similar. Right. And kind of those adaptations upon demands. So we're kind of using the same things in similar ways. And I think that's why I go back to communication is it's just languages and a lot of them are different and similar. But I think the main, let's say, domains or hubs that I kind of look at are typically biology, anatomy, biomechanics, neurology, right? You kind of got to know enough about those things, right? Because those give you the guiding principles for the most part of what make us. So, there's a whole nother level, right? Neurology, just the tip of that, because it can probably branch off into all these other ones, right? Now we're talking about systems thinking and the Alta stuff. But that's kind of where I start. And a lot of times it just keeps me within those boundaries and borders, and that's why I like the way that they phrased it before is like, first thing you should do is come up and define the purpose. Like, what's the whole goal and the purpose of doing this plan, this point, talking about the X, Y, or Z. And that's really what is at the center. And these principles just kind of guide and shape what's, for lack of a better term, like allowed or allotted. And then you can kind of play within that. Okay, so we can do tissue work here. Okay, so we can introduce long duration isometrics. Okay, maybe we can add some motion to that, X, Y, or Z. So there's a lot, but those principles in general, just go back to the basics, right? Know about the body, know about the forces, right? The movements are needed. And I think neurology is really important as well. So it's really just the basic stuff. But if you stay within those principles, then all the other concepts and the methods that you learn or introduce to, they all have a home. They all go back towards those principles. And that's what makes it a little easier, I think, more than anything, is not necessarily seeing like black, white, or gray. It's more just seeing like the pathway and the connections that way. Oh, you're talking about this. Got it. So it's really just more of that.
Mhm. So, as a performance therapist, where do you fit into the performance world? So, take away kind of general population in a clinical setting, but especially with a lot of the things like you said that you have going on now. Where does performance therapy fit into all of that?
Yeah, I think I'll probably use an analogy. Danny's kind of like the fascia guy, right? So I'll use
Mhm.
fascia as an example as well, because we're kind of interwoven within everything. And it's not necessarily saying that we can do everything at the highest level, but it's really that communication again. So having a background of what's typically being done in physiotherapy and physical therapy. What are those principles that they're using? What are the concepts that have been most frequently and recently studied that have given them a lot of validity, right? And then how can we utilize those in practice? And then what are the times and places in those practice? Ideally, not ideally, but I guess most often used in injury, return to play cases. But then there's the performance side, and we still kind of use very similar concepts and principles there too, right? But now we're talking about maybe increasing forces and velocities and stuff like that. So it's really based off inputs to drive outputs, right? So what we physically do on like the physical therapy and that physiotherapy end on the table is we're driving a lot of inputs, right? Trying to get more inputs to get more accurate outputs. And that's the same thing that we do, but just takes different times. So that kind of leads into a little bit of Danny staying in the green model that he's kind of developed.
Mhm.
But really, it's a continuum, and that's why I use fascia as kind of this thing that helps to kind of give the visual of performance therapy, because we're there kind of helping on what you would typically see on the physical therapy side, usually before or after a session. We're also going to help the movement side of things, right? And you'll typically see that right before session and right at the end of session. And then we obviously have a background in strength and conditioning, so that drives into the weight room, and in the performance and sprint mechanics and the on-field, on-track environment, that there's a background there as well. So I think one of the things, and I like the way that Stu kind of defines it as well, or has a definition of it, and it's you kind of got to be somewhat of an expert to in multiple things, just so you can see the different lenses and how they communicate, right? Whereas before we were typically taught you can only do one thing. If you're going to physical therapy, you stay there. That's your home. This is the language you use, and that's it, right? And then when they're done, they leave your office, just close the door, and that's you stay here, right? And strength room was the same thing. Get the coach in there, rah rah, close the doors. Whatever I do is in here. Speed, same thing. So what we're doing is we're just kind of walking in between those doors and having conversations. So in a lot of settings, like in the ideal setting for us, we're there and we're doing a lot of that. So we'll have the opportunity in combine training to do so. We're going to be doing the pre-session. We'll be part of the warm-up. We'll be on field during primary. We'll be in the weight room during that. We'll also have post sessions and really focusing on movement quality and tissue health as well. Whereas sometimes we're just a component part, right? And really only brought into and in one side, we might just work more on the speed end, where Danny and I are really just kind of helping out and managing strategies and small interventions here and there when needed. But they might already have a strength coach. They probably already have a therapist, stuff like that. So we're really just wherever is needed. And then we communicate with them as well. Hey, this is what we did, and we can give a report. Hey, this is what we did. We can show almost like an evaluation of what was going on. And that helps break down those barriers and it just encourages more conversation. So that's why I kind of use that fascia again, because at times and places we'll kind of be highlighted a little bit more, but we're constantly working and we're always in play there, constantly receiving information, passing it on, and then just kind of, using the best of our interventions and inputs to again drive better outputs.
Yeah, I remember Danny, and for those listening, this is Danny Foley, um, talking about how once you guys all started, quote unquote, speaking the same language, it opened up, a whole new lens of how everybody could connect with each other and understand what each other was doing. What does speaking the same language kind of mean to you?
I mean, it's just that. I think we probably heard Stu use an analogy, so I feel bad for defaulting to him again. But again, the first thing you're going to do is you got to probably learn Japanese or find someone that does. You got to learn how to communicate. Um, so it's really just that. That's why on physical therapy side of things, right, and that physiotherapy side of things, we have certain languages, and they're kind of utilized and used, in certain contexts frequently. And on the strength side, it's same thing. Performance speed on the performance skill coaches, same thing. So again, it's kind of like these language barriers, and that's what creates a lot of friction. And the reason I think it creates friction is we don't technically take the time to learn the language. We don't take the time to really understand. So we default saying, I don't trust it, it's not safe, so let's just do what we do. right?
Mhm.
So speaking the same language to me is really just understanding exactly what you mean. I remember one of the first times I met Stu. I think he was probably giving a presentation on a team speed event, and he was talking about defining terms once you use them. And I was like, "This is my guy," because that's what I do. I'm like a weirdo about that. Ask Danny; he hates it. But talking to what are we really talking about? Because that's really important because everything is going to stem off of these terms that we use. So if there's any, disconnect or, no, you know what I mean? No, no, we have to really understand what we mean because that's going to really dictate the next sentence and the next decision. So getting onto the same, oh, that's what you would call this. Got it. So this is the term that we can use. Why do we use that term? Because I would normally use it for this. Okay. So by reverse engineering, all of a sudden we break down little barriers of, oh, you were talking about that. Okay, I won't use that word because I get it. Oh, well, actually, we should use this term because it correctly defines it. So it's a lot of back and forth at a very almost seems basic level, but it's arguably one of the most important things when you're trying to really build something, and specifically when you don't have the time to try to understand. It's high pressure situation in sport. You got to know what I'm saying right now. There isn't. Wait, what do you mean? Nope, that you've already lost. So that's the speed of communication. I think is the most probably important part of it. The speed of understanding. But when you ask what does it mean to speak the same language, it is literally that. When I say this word and use it, I mean this definition, and you know what I mean, so we can get to that next decision or that next statement, quicker.
Speaking of definitions, so just a really, well, maybe not simple one, but something you always hear about is, what is your definition of strength? Is that something like that you guys are all on the same page? Like, what does strength mean to you guys? And is it
Man,
contextual, situational?
shit, we had a good conversation about that coming back from Phoenix one time, and Danny and I have great combos on the way out because it's 6 hours in the car and we're just talking. And we did. We had a conversation for probably over an hour of what we actually mean when we say that, right? And there's context involved, right? So strength, a lot of times we're thinking of just the physical component. Is a tissue strong? Well, the tissue could be strong, but maybe it's in a bad position, which makes that component part weak, which maybe makes the system stronger, but maybe it makes the system weaker. So there's it's multifactorial sometimes, and that's a shit answer, not the one you look for. But for me, strength is just being able to kind of complete what you want to do. So sometimes stability is strength, mobility is sometimes strength, right? And the way that you utilize that for you to complete a task, literally, to me, kind of leans closer to effective and efficient, right? And that would almost dictate closer to now strength because now I'm looking at strength of the capacity or the ability to do so in a sense, right? So not the best answer, but if you almost look at it just for if you want to complete a task, then you typically will look at am I stable enough to coordinate at least or find stability through the ground through my structures to either do something, pick something up, throw something. So to me, strength is multifactorial in a lot of ways, right? Where it's tissue has a strength, the timing of things and the coordination to me sometimes has a strength component because there's parts of the chain that could be weak. So when I zoom out, sometimes I'll look at fascial connections and the tissue alone. But a lot of times I'm also looking, are you in a good position to be strong? Has that force been compromised through the time and the space in which you were trying to execute that strength component or force component? So again, a horrible answer. But again, I try to look more than just tissue strength because I think that's sometimes a factor that leads us astray. Hey, we've
Mhm.
said and found that the hamstring is strong enough now. They can go back to play. Well, how come they repulled it? How come there was another re-injury? To me, that's not strength. So that's a component of strength. The tissue is strong enough, but maybe the system wasn't strong enough. It wasn't coordinated well enough. So there's something else missing. But I look at strength in different ways to make sure that the system is coordinating in the time, speed, efficiencies needed to complete whatever task is, at hand. So
Yeah.
it's a long-winded answer and not the best one ever, but that's kind of how I look at it, man. It's a real, the functionality and being able to complete something in a sense. The effectiveness is a strength. Can you do
Yeah.
something? Yeah, it's effective. Good. He's really good at it. Makes him really strong at that. That's a strong attribute. So he's very effective. So that's kind of how I look at strength.
Yeah, no, but I think that's perfect in how you say it because it just shows how convoluted a lot of things can be and why it is so important to make sure, in this case, you and Danny are on the same page with what you actually define as strength or whatever that quality may be. And what So if an athlete is coming to you, let's just say they're coming to you for they have an injury of some sort. What is your approach to where your starting point is to help with them? Like, what kind of system do you have, or things that you're thinking about in your mind when an athlete is coming to you, specifically somebody who might be injured?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to have a sexy answer here. It's probably very similar to what most are already doing, and that's first we're going to just get to know you. I need to know your injury history, where you've been, who you are, right? And that alone tells me a lot. After that, we have a passive movement screen where I'll put you there. I'll move you around a little bit. Gives me an idea as far as like just positionally or posturally, kind of where things might be aligned. You have tissue checks, just kind of feeling the tone, different side to side, and then an active one. So typically walking is another the movement one of choice, and then depending all the way up to skipping and sprinting. So always injury history in general is always the biggest for me, and probably for most. And then like most, I'm on the table, kind of seeing how they move, structurally, and then I want to see them on their feet moving around a little bit.
Got you. And that also actually brings me, it's probably a good time. Man, I'm gonna have to have Danny on this podcast because he's coming up a lot. But he had asked a question for me to ask you. Um, and it was, what does return to run mean? And what are the primary things that you're looking for or that you're trying to focus on? So I'm sure there's a reason that he put that in my Instagram. So let's see what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, return to run is probably very synonymous with return to play, right? There's definitely similarities there for sure. Returning to run is again close to return to play because now we're talking about things and mechanics that we might see, but also the forces, velocity that are needed for performing whatever task or sport at hand. So returning to run is probably a continuum or a branch that extends from the initial return to play, right? So if you're come off and you're injured, we kind of know that we can't get you onto the field. But one of the screenings and the things that we kind of utilize and most do is, can we get you back to speed? Can we get you back to performance? So that's essentially what return to run is, right? We've kind of used those same or similar analysis, right? We're going to use all the metrics that we have, whatever's available, whether that's just a simple video of you running, or if we have all the force plate data and in-person measurements. But returning to run is, how can we break down what we need to really focus on, create a plan and implement that plan so that we can improve the time needed and get to these landmarks to get you back to performance, right? So it's a lot of just breaking down how to get there in a sense. And returning to run again is, can we produce the forces? Can we handle those velocities? And then can we build the threshold of capacities needed again in that sport or in that task of choice?
So is that something you're thinking about with almost any athlete that may come to you, or just specifically with certain types of injuries?
Pretty much everyone, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Sprinting is a great expression, right? Especially if moving at high, your fastest velocities. It's a very great expression and a good movement screen to kind of see how that person again is expressing. Um,
Hmm.
so getting them back to be able to handle those velocities is definitely a goal of mine, specifically in return to sport, return to run, right? Because we also want to make sure that, in the return to play, old school mentality was kind of, once they're pain free in movement here, you go play. Very similar to what we talked about. Well, their hamstring is strong enough, they should be able to go play, and then they re-injure it. So return to run is much more of that gap in between.
Hmm.
Are they really ready to return to sport healthy, or is their body just healthy, right? So is the movement quality at an efficient point to handle the effectiveness in which they want to execute, right? So that's where return to run kind of plays in. Can we make sure that there is more efficient movement that we can then make more effective to be utilized most frequently, right? And that's really building on, very similar to what I said earlier, is building those capacities, those coordinations, those strengths, right? At all those things needed between the forces and velocities and the changes of direction these cells needed for the sports.
Hmm. So getting a little bit more into kind of the X's and O's side of things. One thing you presented on way back when we first met was the foot and ankle, the foot ground interaction, how that all works up into the hip and into the spinal engine and all of that sort of stuff. I want to zoom in. I know that's a lot. So let's zoom in on just the foot ground interaction. And when you hear that, what are you thinking?
Yeah, when I hear that, or when I just think of that, I'm thinking of the relationship. I
Hmm.
think of the relationship between how you're literally interacting with the ground. So I get curious. I get curious on why your foot is striking that way, why your body is now moving after it strikes that way. Why was that preference used? Why was it used once? Why was it used all the time? And it just leads different questions. So once I'm looking at foot ground interaction, those are the curiosities I get. What is your actual relationship with the ground? And then from there, how do you express it through? Because the next primary pattern is hip extension. We need that in human locomotion. So when I see the hip extension pattern, I also get curious, is that because of how that foot interacted and that ankle interacted? Or is there something else going on? So it has a lot of questions, but I think the questions help me narrow down what I'm really trying to figure out. So when I first think is, okay, that relationship looks soft or it looks very stiff. Okay, so what is that? What could that mean? Right? Stiffness can be a good thing. Sometimes it's not the best thing. So why is it being utilized? Why was it actually utilized on, why was her center of mass kind of on the outside of her foot on the right side or on the inside on the left? Why was the left foot turned out? Why was the right foot, overpronated or oversupinated at first interaction? So it just gets me to ask these questions because it kind of gives me an idea of how they really feel about going and falling onto that leg, right? Or pushing off of it. So when I go to the hip extension, I try to look, is the hip or the pelvis compensating for that foot in a reason, right? Was that interaction so kind of sloppy and flat and not springy that my hip now has to create stability and stiffness in order to now push myself forward, right? And for how long, at what time, at what place. So that's when going back to your initial question, when I hear that, I think of the relationship and how it could affect everything else that's going to happen next.
What I know you say it brings, you're always kind of asking questions and trying to ask why something's happening. How do you get to the answers eventually?
I feel like they being the athlete, the client, they typically kind of will give you the answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the athlete a lot of times is we're trying to give them access to best express themselves, to best find themselves on the ground, to use these forces, speeds, strengths, velocities, all that stuff. So how do we give them access to get more expressive and really utilize everything that they got? And that's where I really get curious. So if I see a foot, again, that's not very stiff at all, it's just smashing on the ground, maybe there's some injury history that helps explain that. But if not, I'm kind of getting curious, well, why is that happening? And then we start to look and then we find out, look at the history. Oh, there was a hip issue or they have this happening or feeling this. Well, maybe that's why they're moving that way. So maybe you get it curious and then you try, one of those safe to fail experiments. And I say, let's try this. Let's try a couple of reps of this, or I want you to feel this, pressurize this, whatever that intervention is. And then you give it a go. And if all of a sudden things get a little bit better, well, now we have a better path. The path that the funnel at first was, very wide and we just kind of narrowed it down a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of what I am trying to do most frequently is find the right, lack of a better term, frequency, but, find the right path that the athlete really wants to utilize. What's the right access point? Because I don't want to just give access if it takes away from what they really wanted, which might have been stability. Or I don't want to create stability when really what they, what their body and what they would prefer was more mobility and flexibility. So it's really just constantly trying to fine tune and get closer, to the term that I guess, Stu uses a lot and Danny also uses is resonance. I'm trying to figure out what best helps them attune so that they can utilize side to side motion a little bit more, again, effectively and efficiently.
What do you have to understand from a neurological or neurology aspect to make some of the decisions that you're making?
Get curious and, I guess try to learn and get different concepts and methods. No, there's a lot that you want to learn, but you also don't want to get caught in the weeds with, because then you also have to ask certain questions of context too. So we were out in Phoenix recently and there was a group and we were kind of talking about foot and ground interaction. And, we had a few people walking and then we kind of had like a group vote, like whose walk do we want to talk about and discuss the most? We're like, all right, let's talk about his, because everyone, it was almost easy to see. And then at that point, everyone's digging on this guy. Oh, well, his foot's this, and his ankle's this, and oh, this is why, and it's terrible. Well, background is he played hockey for a very long time. So let's switch the context. Foot ground interaction on the ice. Who thinks he has the worst feet now? No, he's got the best. So you don't want to just go changing things because we see it. We want to know the context of which they're in. So that's the first one. You want to know the context. So it's really important to have context on everything and not just a quick, chat search, because context is really, really important. But then after that, you do need to know again these principles. So knowing how the anatomy actually work. What is the anatomy of the foot and ankle? How is it supposed to work? What are those gait mechanics? Right? At what time, at what place, what forces, what's this? Oh, there's a windlass mechanism. Got it. Okay, and there's these two. Okay, and then the ankle should roll. So all those things you kind of need to be aware of. To a certain degree, you don't necessarily need to be the foot expert, but you need to know a decent amount to kind of make those connections. Because then all of a sudden you see an ankle or a foot that's too stiff, too rigid. You're not getting this, pronation again. The foot's not necessarily splaying, maybe not coming up the big toe, blah, blah, blah. No, internal rotation of the tibia, whatever. If we're seeing something that's too stiff there, now it gets me curious on, well, what's that gonna do, or why is it stiff? Is it stiff because it's in a bad position and this is the only way it can stay safe? Was there an injury there? So again, it kind of brings you back to context. So you zoom into the information that you need to know. What are these principles and these concepts that I should really know? And then you got to zoom out and see the context of the situation and the person. And then you zoom back in and see how it's interacting, try to fail safe, zoom back out. How does that work for them? Then you zoom back in. Okay, well, that worked here. Now I want you to feel that same movement, stiffness, compliance, whatever at the foot and ankle. And now let's connect that with this hip motion, this pelvic positioning, whatever it is. And now let's integrate that for a few reps or a couple drills. And then let's see it again. And then you're constantly going back and forth. So, again, another example of kind of zooming in, zooming out. But I think that's kind of the important part. You always want to know enough information of what you're trying to understand, but then you really need the context to make sense of it.
Yeah, and I guess I asked that specifically because, well, you hear obviously, the brain's, the CNS's main function is to obviously keep us safe and healthy and whatever that may mean for that person. And so when you said things like, maybe the ankle is, or the foot ground interaction isn't as stiff as we want it, so we're going to create stiffness another place, or vice versa, is just having, I guess, those lines of thought that you're able to access in your head to then, come up with a safe to fail experiment so that you can try and zoom in and zoom out, like you said.
Yeah, man. And so, you always want to keep, again, the principles will keep you safe,
Hmm.
will keep you on that direction in the path. Like, to your point, number one rule, don't die, right? So we
Yep.
know that everything's going to change and modify to make sure that happens. Okay, so what does that mean? Safety is a big priority. Okay, well, how do I make sure things are safe? Well, you know what? We're going to make sure you can recognize certain patterns because that gives you a predictability of what might happen to kind of then make judgment calls and decisions to, again, stay safe. So we're constantly trying to manage these predictable patterns. So what do? We also have patterns and we constantly, so it's a very almost, I don't want to say basic and simple, but if you get back to that path of just what is this system really trying to do? Not die. Got it. Okay. What are we trying to do? Run through a person that's in pads at full speed. Okay. So let's look at what's needed between A and B. And then you kind of just develop that path through there. And that way it just keeps you a little safer. Again, to your first points, there's so much information out there that we kind of forget these main principles, like the main things. And if we just go back to some of these basics, then we can kind of connect these dots that we're constantly seeing and hearing. But, again, we bypass that and like, it's the foot and it's this. What about the foot? So there is a lot out there, and I don't think it's super easy to navigate. Again, I think that's one of the things that I'm going to hopefully try to do more of in the future is kind of provide at least either some resources or some extra insight on at least how I've been able to utilize that and navigate that. Because I think that we're probably all talking very similar and looking at the same things, but just a little nervous on how we're going to define them sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And how do you, so obviously also quite popular now is this stiffness versus compliance. When do we want stiffness? How much stiffness? How can we create that stiffness? And then on the flip side of that, what about the compliance? How do you think about stiffness versus compliance? And also in that, whether it's foot and ankle stiffness or lower leg stiffness or creating system stiffness, how do you think about these things?
Man, balance. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And then again, circumstances are really important too. Like if you played soccer your whole life and you're a professional soccer player, your ankles might be a little bit more compliant due to the forces, the angles. You're constantly kicking a ball, this that. They might be a little bit more compliant than a sprinter who's running on a hard track all day long in minimal spikes. So we just kind of want to be aware of those qualities. I go back to the guy who was the hockey player, on ice all the time. So there's gonna be some changes there. So when I think about compliance, or when I just think about, I don't want to call them competitive, but I guess oppositional situations, stiffness, compliance on different ends, right? A balance. At certain times you want stiffness, at certain times you want compliance. How much, how of each? Well, it kind of depends on what you're capable of doing, because you might want that ankle to be compliant. Why? Because you're not somewhere else. So it's doing its best. Like, that's not a bad thing. It's just what is. So there's always a balance to everything. I really like the way that Stu kind of phrased it, because he kind of gets away from optimality a lot, right? And this idea of having everything a 10 out of 10. And he talks about it, and he's like, it might be better if you just get everything closer to about all eights instead of trying to have a 10, 10, 10, and a 4 over here, right? It's probably better just to kind of keep everything a little bit more balanced. And I believe that too. Stiffness qualities and compliant qualities, again, goes really heavily back to the context of the individual, the athlete, the sport, blah, 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 blah. But doesn't mean that we're not going to try to improve upon certain qualities, even if they may be catered towards that sport more. Because having too low of a deficit in one, now you're at potential for injury or risk of injury, something like that. So there is a health concern, a possibility as well. So it's hard to always try to navigate that. But to your, recent question is, you got to know enough about where you're going and the information needed, but you also need the context. Don't just try to go adding everyone needs everything, because they probably need a balance more than anything. And then, to be honest, a balance doesn't mean perfect here. It could be balanced like that. That could be a really solid balance. This might not be the best, but it doesn't need to be completely even. That might not be the best situation, for that individual, at all.
What strategies are you using to create those things? And kind of building on that, how do you know if you're, or what's your gauge for how much you want to build into, maybe their stiffness is, a strength of theirs, but also a reason that maybe they're a little bit more susceptible to an injury, versus, we could work a little bit on the compliance side, but maybe they don't perform as well. How do you think about that?
It goes kind of back to where, like, what's really going on. So was there an injury there? Was something going on? What else is going on through the system and through that body, through that side, through that limb? And then you kind of got to narrow it down to make sure that this is a right call to try a safe to fail here, right? And that's, again, another key thing. You're not going in there trying to make massive change right now. I'm actually somewhat, sometimes on the other end of manipulations and hands-on, like, adjustments, right? I kind of side a little bit closer to, I want active motion. I want them to kind of create space and find these ways. Not saying that, I don't utilize passive interventions by any means, definitely will. But in that sense, sometimes too much change that the system can't process, I think, actually puts you at a higher risk. So everything has to, again, be calibrated and understood by the system, right, which is the individual. And then it has to be interpreted and utilized within the context or the sport, right? So there's a lot of checks that need to go. And that's why it's safe to fail. And then you kind of have them move around, right? As, they give you feedback, I'm feeling this, I'm noticing this, I like this. We have more, but you need two. And when I say that, I typically mean you want their subjectiveness, but you also want yours as well, right? And if you can, then, put them on some other stuff, make it a little bit more objective, force plate them, something like that within a 90% range, sure. But if they say pain levels are down, discomfort is down, I see their motion looks more fluid, looks a little stronger and better, then I think we're heading on the right path there. Then if we get numbers that improve as well, then we know we're really where we want to be.
What's other than, just having conversations with athletes, learning about them, their history, and that side of things, and also just looking at how they move, what are some of your assessment, I guess, protocols that you find yourself using with most of the athletes that you work with?
Yeah, again, getting them on the table, and their injury history is a big one, so we're not going to take too much time on that. But getting them on the table, right? I want to see how their limbs kind of move passively. It kind of gives me an idea of where axially they might be positioned. So as I move, the leg around, the hip around, kind of gives me an idea where the pelvis might be positioned. And then from there, honestly, walking and sprinting is a really big factor of analysis for me, right? So I'm even kind of working on, somewhat of an assessment that I can use to help better communicate what I'm seeing and how I would go about interventions. But that's a big one for me, is, again, how do they express things? But I also want to make sure that, again, passively, and locally, things are also attributing there. So sometimes you go into the basics, and depending on the severity or the timeliness of injury, manual muscle testing is a big one. That's easy, right? Because you just want to have some checks that, kind of confirm where you're headed. Pain is always a major driver for me. If pain was at a 5, we do some interventions. Now all of a sudden it's down to a 3 or a 2. Okay, let's keep building. But yeah, those are kind of the assessment points. Their movement is key. And again, their words are very important.
Are there any, again, I know we're kind of being general here, but Are there any general things that you found with people where, you know, for example, maybe most people you find need to be able to access more hip interrotation or X, Y? Like, is there any kind of checklist of things that you think, most people could benefit by having more access to X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, if I had to say one thing, and which is your question, what would be the one
Yeah.
thing? Pelvic positioning, and I think the positioning of the femur is due to that, right? And then also the spine. Low back pain and issues are still a thing. Hamstring issues, adductors, hip flexors is still a thing. Managing, internal pressures and center of mass is still a thing. So I think just getting a better idea of pelvic positioning and kind of what that really means in terms of what it can do to your hip as far as like where the femur is positioned and how it moves. And the same thing with your back, right? And your lumbar. So I would kind of just say the more that we spend on that would probably give a little bit more insights too. Because we tend to focus very distal sometimes. So
Mhm.
one thing for me is I'm typically looking at pelvic positioning, right? I want to make sure that not just, posterior toe, anterior toe, it's side to side. And I want to make sure that the femur has space. So sometimes and oftentimes as I find a lot of like tightness or limitation, restriction in posterior hip capsules, right? So
Mhm.
if and then I ask why, could that be contributing to SI pain and discomfort, right? Because then you just go back to your principles and your basics. Okay, well, if my pelvis is anteriorly tilted, and if I'm biasing positions that push me into more extension, okay, well then technically my femurs might externally rotate in conjunction to that, positioning of the pelvis. Okay, and then with that positioning of the pelvis, technically it also compresses those SI joints. Okay, and then also that's going to bias and almost keep me into extension. So I kind of just piece around and ask those questions to get to that. But to your question, what would be like the one thing I really focus on that pelvis, to be honest with you. A lot of times people look at sacrum. Sometimes
Mhm.
that's a little bit difficult for me. I almost look at the iliums. I think that's almost a little bit easier for me to kind of get a better idea. Um, but I think that's a big one because once you get there, then you kind of brings you closer to the spine. And when you're back into the spine, then you're looking at the thorax and the rib cage. And we kind of get more axial. And again, back to some of the principles of being proximal before distal, I think that's an important part as well. So I would focus there. I think that's one part that we could probably just utilize better because if we don't have the space for my hip to create this motion because of a position that it's been biased or put in, which is also creating compression somewhere else, or biasing another position upstream or downstream, then we're constantly adding in different inputs when really we might just be missing kind of the center of it all.
Do you find that a lot of people that may come to you with, let's just say, a lower back um, pain, looking at their pelvis and creating that space, as you say, is that something that usually can help out somebody like that, or is it completely situational?
It definitely situational, but to be honest, I look at the pelvis pretty frequently for anything. You come in with, you're
Yeah.
asking me with me for migraines, like we're gonna see where that pelvis is at. I know that sounds crazy. If you come in with like breathing issues and that's what you're reaching out for, neck pain, like I'm starting at the pelvis, and even at the feet sometimes when I look at the pelvis, um, because I need to know what's going on in the center and how everything is organizing and going around it. And hip extension is a major thing. So maybe this is another better way to kind of define why I would start there is, you know, when I was getting a lot of people reaching out for back pain, and I was really trying to study and learn more, meeting with therapists and physios and chiros, and there was this big emphasis on making sure that they can get hip extension without excessive or early lumbar extension.
Lumbar. Yeah.
Okay, well, that seems to be a pretty, we did old school Thomas test was like the thing, right? We put everyone there. We would laugh at them because their legs and hip flexors were tight. We tell them to stretch their hip flexors forever, pull on that femur forward to just stretch that capsule out, right? Um, so we did focus on it at one point, but for me, it's I want to reposition and make sure things are at least in a good place and that are capable to do what's needed for the most.
So, would you say you have more of a kind of proximal to distal approach, or like a bottom to top approach, or how do you think about those sort of things? Because I feel like different systems.
Mhm.
Again, going back to just information that's out on the internet. One system is, oh, we're top down. One system is we're bottom up. One system is we're proximal to distal. So how do you navigate that?
Uh, Probably a bit of both, to be honest with you. You're right. Um,
I
or a bit of both, a bit of all of them. So it goes back to first things first. Top down is don't die. Got it. Foot's hitting the ground. Feedback. Got it. So that's kind of important. how I'm organizing that and all the internal, proximal to distal, also really important. So I'm constantly seeing that interaction. I'm getting curious on how they're interacting, when and why. And that's kind of goes back to my first, one of the things we were talking about is I get curious on why they're finding center of pressure or safety there. Okay, so we know they have left SI pain. Well, why on the right side are they finding this landmark on their foot? Why do they keep extending their right hip in this way or in this range? So it just adds to those questions. So am I top down, bottom up, proximal distal, in out, a little bit of everything. But I think that kind of goes back to those principles, is because they're constantly at effect. If you only look at one, then you're kind of going to disregard the other one. Foot interacting with the ground, really important. I also want to know why the foot hit the ground there. So that might be proximal to distal. And then I want to understand what I'm thinking about or feeling as that foot hits the ground. So that's technically top down. So it's a little bit of all of them, but I think that also just allows me to not be overly fixated on trying to solve the problem. And again, it just kind of keeps me asking those questions to help, hopefully give access and the opportunity for the athlete or client to then hopefully expose those answers.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it just keeps kind of bringing back to my point of, especially talking to someone, as intelligent as you, and you saying, this isn't the only way to do something. There's a lot of reasons to do a lot of different things. It just shows that it doesn't have to be just this way or just that way. It can be, a little bit of everything, and what obviously fits best contextually for your situation, but also for you and how you think.
And that's not a bad way to just have one thing. There are
Yeah.
people having great success in doing either the one thing or looking at it from their lens. And that's what, honestly, without them, I don't think a lot of us get to certain places, because we need to learn. And those curiosities are what drive you to try to pick out, or, okay, what are they saying? What is that? Okay, how are they using that method? Okay, that's based off of what concept? Oh, got it. It's right back to this principle. Cool. So then it just makes it a little bit more fun to try to see how we're all really at the same party, but there's just different music going on in different rooms.
Yeah. And it's also, it really just shows what is the through line that goes through all of them, which I guess, which is the principles essentially.
Yeah.
And so I want to be wary of your time, but the last thing that I did want to touch on, because we talked about the foot ground interaction, we now touched on the pelvis, and so the last part that I did want to touch on is just the spine and the spinal engine, and how what role is the spine playing in locomotion and in performance, and how you think about it.
Yeah. Spinal engine theory, I think, it's gotten a lot of conversation in previous years. It's getting a little bit louder and a little bit more
Hmm.
utilized, studied now. Um, and concepts, principles, theories, looking at the same, but really making sure that it's not so rigid. I think that's one thing. It's almost like this pendular shift now, right? We're hearing a lot about spinal engine because before we knew the answers. It was brace, create intra-abdominal pressure, and hold on firm here, and there you go. And it's not that that's not good in certain situations or times, populations, what have you. But the idea that we should really take all of these bones with a really important thing running down between them and just hold it still at all points probably doesn't make sense. And then as we analyze, watch movement, then we kind of know that it's actually probably not supposed to be that way. So the spinal engine is a theory, right? And utilizing it, just knowing that the spine should move in these planes. It should have flexion extension. It should have lateral flexion moving, the frontal plane. And then it should also have rotational, capabilities and capacities as well, because we kind of utilize that as we locomote. There's a rotation, a reciprocal rotation, and counter rotations, right? S curves and positioning of center of masses. So it's really important to kind of at least just acknowledge those, I guess, principles of movement. And then the spinal engine, I kind of almost look at it more of an expression. I kind of want to see what's being expressed up top during their sprint, their jumps, their sport, their movement, because that kind of gives me an idea of, again, their expression. We talked earlier about pattern recognition, and one of the things that we do is if I see you with a face, right, an expressive face, sad face, happy face, what happens is my brain or my eyes see you doing that face, and I'm thinking, oh wait, when I make that face and I work those muscles, I feel this way. So then I ask you, hey, are you feeling okay? You're like, how'd you know? Well, because technically, when I feel that way, I make that face too. We don't say that, but that's essentially what's going on. So we recognize patterns, right? So when I see someone move, I'm trying to get an idea of what's being expressed there. Tight, rigid, very loose, very relaxed. More rotation one side, not on the other. Could that mean? More side bending on one side compared to the other. What could that mean? No side bending. So it just again adds to those questions that help us kind of I get closer and closer to the answers, I think, of what and why they're expressing movements in that way. And then we can again go back, is it because of the foot? Is it at the hip? Is it at the spine based off position or movement? And then we kind of go back through spine, hip, foot, hip, spine, and round we go. But it just helps to really almost answer a lot of the questions, and we see that sequencing of movement because we have one foot, we hip extend from one side, and we move one central spine forward or in direction of choice. Two, the other side to then do the same thing and alternate round and round we go. So the expression of that movement and the change and transition between it, I think is really important. And that's why I use it really heavily as a gait analysis or movement analysis as well. This gives more insight of what's being expressed and why they may be utilizing that strategy or that strength capacity in that particular movement.
And when we're doing spinal engine exercises, are we doing that with the purpose of essentially like mobility, but for the spine, or is that to integrate the spine into everything else we're doing?
I think that you could look at it in multiple ways, right? Because it's no different in the sense that we want to have enough stability, enough mobility, enough strength, enough access. I
Hmm.
think what we've done is, again, kind of talking about that pendular shift, is we created a lot of rigidity in most of the populations that we see and work with. And that's not just in our industry, it's kind of been promoted and talked about for years. So when we run into people, there's typically a long or a residual of creating stiffness in the spine. What we want to at least just have some allowance or allotment of motion in the spine. So that's why I think will see, at least in the beginning phases, is it's really not loaded and it's just a lot of just motion. Can we just get some motion going through the spine and create some more access, right? A little bit more freedom of movement, right? A little less restriction. And I think that's why we utilize it most at first. And then we get a little bit more particular, maybe positions of choice, add in the foot ground interactions and pelvic mechanics. So it definitely can tie in, and there's definitely progressions and regressions. But to your point, I think at first one of the goals is just make sure we have access and that we're not holding this overly rigid structure because it doesn't need to be and maybe probably shouldn't be, right? So when we're doing it, that's why I think it's unloaded, it's low volume but high frequency. And then what you'll see is progressions and different loads, throws, and just movement patterns. And that's one of the things that we want to encourage when we're looking at locomotion for sure.
And then on the flip side to that, are you ever doing anything where, that's quote unquote trunk or core exercises where you're trying to create some of that stability or rigidity and or loaded in some way, whether it's a Pallof press or anything like that, where we are trying to do more of what your traditional, I guess, quote unquote core work would be?
Yeah, there's going to be exercises and movements that I'll choose that are typically or commonly used for sure. But I always try to add some dynamic motion to it. Like stiffness in sport, we want it at certain times and we want it a little bit more reflexively. So I might try to introduce it more in that sense, right? But depending on where you're at, doesn't mean that we might not choose something a little bit more basic or, commonly seen in, hey, I'm dealing with SI pain and it's hurting right now. I'm at a 6 or a 7 out of pain. Well, then maybe we're not going to add too much reflexive, motion right now. Let's make sure it's just a little bit more controlled, motor control, back to basics. Can we just focus and get these positions, create pressures, blah, blah, blah. So again, time and place for everything. But you kind of want to know just enough about the context and what you're doing so that you don't really run too wild where those principles would normally constrain you.
Yep, perfect. Sounds good. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. I do really appreciate your time and you coming on to chat. And I know you said obviously in 2026 we might be seeing a little more things from you, whether that's educationally or however it may be. So if you want to plug any Instagram account or any place that people could get in touch with you or find out more about what you're doing, then go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Would love to chat. Please reach out. You can follow me on Instagram. It's just Chris Guarin with an underscore under it. And yeah, would love to reach out and love to touch base with y'all. So if anyone wants to, happy to talk shop.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much.
Absolutely, my man. Thank you.